Well, Saudi Arabia is open for business. Now, why would you care? Why would you want to go to Saudi Arabia? Well, if you care about Mount Sinai, if you care about biblical truth, you might want to go there and see Mount Sinai. And now you actually can. In fact, our guest, who we'll introduce in just a second, took a tour group over there in October of this last year. And as the Bible leads us to the Messiah, it also leads us to the truth about Mount Sinai. And there's some things we don't know yet, but we're going to find out today from our guest. Please welcome Joel Richardson. Joel, you are an author, teacher, and researcher of all things biblical. Welcome to Shabbat Night Live.
It's great to be back with y'all.
Now, I mentioned that that Sinai is open. Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia is open for business, and that happened just recently. And you took what was it, the world's first Christian tour of Mount Sinai over there?
Yeah. So this was October 2019, and we took, as you said, the first group of Christians, an open Christian tour into Saudi Arabia in history. What was interesting is we were working with my tour guide, my tour company had been working this for quite some time. And initially, we had a special, we actually were getting in on Hajj visas. So the Hajj is the Muslim pilgrimage. But just before we went, they actually opened the country to tourism visas. And so last minute, we switched over to tourism visas. It was about a week or two after they opened it up to tourism, we came in and kind of made a big splash, and it was an amazing time.
Now, why? This is a big deal. I mean, if people hear, outside of people who really want to go see the real Mount Sinai and people who know this to be true, they might say, why in the world would Saudi Arabia open to Christian tourists? What's the point here?
This is an amazing time in history. So for those who have been paying attention over the past few years, you've had this figure emerge, the crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and he's the son of the king, expected to become the king when the elderly king passes on. And he's a reformer. He really is a reformer. There was a group of evangelical sort of diplomats led by Joel Rosenberg that went over about a year and a half ago and met with him. And he is instituting sweeping changes. They might not seem significant to us, but issues like women driving, opening the country to tourism, to foreign tourists. It used to be that you could only get in if you had a work visa. You had to have business in the kingdom. He realizes that in order to diversify the economy, he needs to, it can't just be oil. So now they're trying to open up tourism. There's this massive development project up in the Northeast called NEOM. They want to build a futuristic mega city. And there are all kinds of other initiatives. So it is in light of this that we rode the crest of the sovereign wave of God's timing. And we're just blessed to be part of it.
So tell us about that tour. What did you do? Those folks went over there and I'm assuming you went to Mount Sinai.
We did, yeah. We went to Mount Sinai, and it's really quite interesting. There are quite a few different archaeological sites and locations to visit. So we had a few days to go to Mount Sinai itself, as well as the Split Rock, which is a few hours away. We went to the caves of Jethro and all of these things. And I would say probably the highlight of the trip was when we gathered together, again, 25 Christians. We held hands, we got in a circle, gathered together next to the altar that Moses built at the base of Mount Sinai. And of course, we had several Saudi drivers with us. This is not, you don't just hop in a tour bus. You have to rent a whole bunch of Toyota Land Cruisers and make a drive way out in the middle of nowhere.
So it's a modern caravan.
Exactly, yeah. And a bunch of young Saudi guys. We held hands and we sang some hymns and we prayed and we thanked the Lord. And we thanked the Lord for moving on the heart of the Saudi government, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, for welcoming us and receiving us into the kingdom. And we said, Lord, this is your mountain. This is your mountain. And even as we've been welcomed into the kingdom, we say, welcome home, welcome home. And I don't know how to explain it. I'm not a real woo-woo kind of guy, but it was like all of the work that others have put into this over the years, Ron Wyatt, the Caldwells, Bob Cornuke, all of the different visitors that have gone and sort of they've carried the stigma of this, the mockery. I felt like it was as though we almost gave birth in the spirit, just to be able to worship at the base of the mountain. It felt like something was being lifted, and it was a powerful sort of stake in the ground in the spirit, if you will.
That's wonderful. What kind of impact did, because I know that when we have Passover at a hotel, when we're able to do that type of thing, those who are even just serving at the tables, who aren't part of the event, they see it, they're looking at what is going on here. And they're brought to tears by the story that Michael tells while we are there. So are the Saudis that you encounter there impacted by just the marvel that Christians have for this mountain in the middle of their country?
There's a curious relationship that they have. On one hand, the Bedouins are just, out there, with their goats going, why are you guys interested? They know that it's the mountain of Moses. They're aware of it, but they're kind of like, but why do you have all this interest? So they're curious. But in terms of, for example, so we had Saudi tour guides. They were very welcoming, very gracious. They said, you want to open your Bible and read from the scriptures? No problem. I mean, that's a first in Saudi Arabia. They said, we'll read from the Quran and explain how these things are relevant we said, okay, wonderful.
Oh, wow.
So that was wonderful. But the drivers themselves, they were all sitting back with their cameras out, filming us. And of course, there's a bit of a language barrier, but they were very interested. They were very curious. And we had, I'll just say, a wonderful exchange. It was very different than what a lot of people would assume. Now, look, Saudi Arabia does have a problem with some radicals. And we did get a call from the State Department. They were concerned about us singing hymns or opening the Bible and this type of thing. We said, look, we're not going to do anything unless we've been invited to do so. And the Saudis themselves that were there leading us gave us full permission. And there was just a wonderful exchange of, I think, when Christians and Muslims get together and actually meet each other face to face, as opposed to just the distance of the internet, good things actually happen.
Well, and you found that firsthand, because I know that from the time we've had you on Shabbat Night Live before to talk about your book, Mount Sinai in Arabia, and we know that you are one who likes to build bridges, to reach out to the Muslims and say, hey, we're not who you think we are, you're not who we think you are. And so I think that we really appreciate what you do there, and I can totally see how that would come about when you're meeting face to face, like you said, instead of just over the internet.
Yeah, and it's not just ecumenical kumbaya. I mean, we're uncompromisingly gospel-centered followers of Yeshua, and they're uncompromisingly followers of Muhammad and Islam. But, not every Muslim is a radical that wants to cut our head off and this type of thing. In fact, the majority are not. And so among all of the good things that are happening with Saudi Arabia opening, I actually think that as Christians and average Muslims rub shoulders, that a tremendous amount of good can actually come out of that.
And we see that in Israel. Michael often mentions that in Israel he had Muslim neighbors who he was very good friends with, very good friends with rabbi buddies of his, and everybody gets along. Everybody's got their little quarters in Jerusalem or whatever, but it's we're all human.
Yep.
And we're all just trying to find our own version of truth, as it were. Now, while you were there, I want to bring out some new things that you saw in October 2019. And that is, first of all, some new petroglyphs that you'd seen out there. Now, there's petroglyphs out there, of course, that some people will be skeptics of, the cows, Apis and Hathor, that we all assume are Apis and Hathor because that's what Jim and Penny Caldwell identified them as, and we say, oh, well, that's Apis and Hathor. People say, no, it's just a bunch of cows written on the side of a rock. What did you see there, and what convinced you?
Yeah, and so this is really fascinating. So we've seen the petroglyphs, these carvings of the cows on what we call the golden calf altar. We believe it to be the golden calf altar. And very close to it are a few other murals, again, with all sorts of bovine petroglyphs, cows, whether it's Hathor and Apis or some other cow god from Egypt, we're not really sure. But here's the thing is, in going back, I noticed some things that I had not noticed before. And as I began to do some more research, I said, look, the skeptics say these are just typical pastoral scenes. These are just farmers. This has nothing to do with worship. These are not religious symbols. And what I found proves clearly, not only that they are religious symbols, but that the images are conveying religious worship and that they came from Egypt. So I want to look at some pictures.
Okay.
Okay, so here's just a picture of one of the cows. We've seen a lot of these different cows. Well, here is a picture of a frieze from Egypt. Okay, this is in the tomb of Pharaoh Seti. And it's not the clearest picture, so I've got another picture here where someone drew this picture. And you notice the person underneath the cow, looking like they're bench pressing the cow. Well, also notice the person holding the tail. Okay, you've got several other people there. Now, this is, just to emphasize, this is Egyptian religious iconography. Okay, now here is one of the murals that's close to the golden calf altar. Notice the person underneath the cow in identical form, in a very peculiar identical form to this religious iconography in Egypt. Okay, this is not just traditional pastoral scenes. This is religious iconography that came from Egypt. But notice this, and this is what I had never noticed before. Here's another one of the cows. See the person holding the tail? It's a stick figure, so it's really easy to miss, but you can see the 2 feet at the bottom. Well, there's actually a few of these. Here's another person holding the tail of the cow. Again, I'm not a farmer, I'm not a shepherd, but I know that's not how you do it, This is, again, portraying very specific, we don't know exactly what it means, but we can, with confidence, say this is religious iconography that came from Egypt. Even more so, when we look at the catastrophe, the golden calf catastrophe, as they were worshiping the golden calf. In Exodus 32, 6-7, it says that as they rose up early, they were offering burnt offerings to the golden calf. They brought peace offerings. It says the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. Now, that term in the Hebrew has sexual connotations. It has the connotations of an orgy, of a religious orgy, okay? So they ate and drank, they rose up to play. Well, what's interesting is that in the mural of all the different cows, many of us have seen this particular mural. And again, this is something I wasn't looking for, I hadn't paid attention to. But when you look at all of the figures, the human figures in this mural, and there are several, every single one of them has an erection. And so I always joke, I say, listen, guys, this is not your typical guy's hunting trip, okay? Every one of the men is engaged in some type of sexual activity. Again, the very same mural that we've already seen has the clear markings of Egyptian religious iconography. It's as though when you're looking at this and you're reading the scriptures, it is the biblical storybook. These images clearly tie into the biblical narrative. So even moving forward, after Moses came down off of the mountain, the Lord says, your people have corrupted themselves. Go down immediately. In Exodus 32, verse 19, it says, it came about, as soon as Moses came near the camp, he saw the calf and the dancing. Okay, so they were dancing. There was, again, they rose up to play. There was dancing. Another one of the murals, and I always looked at this and didn't think much of it, again, clearly portrays dancing. And again, a little more detail, they're naked. Okay, so just point after point after point, it confirms the biblical narrative in very, very specific ways, in ways that I think at this point, the skeptics who say, oh, this is just pastoral scenes of cows, there are other bovine petroglyphs in Arabia, this is nothing. In order to deny that this has religious connotations, that it has connections to Egypt, I think they have to be deliberately deceitful. I mean, I think the connections at this point are really very clear.
Yeah, it seems pretty undeniable that these things match what you saw in Seti's tomb there. And even just the pictures of the cows, the way they're sectioned off and they have very clear markings. This is something very specific that I don't think can be denied. Now, this type of drawing is it's almost like a historical piece of something that's a little more recent from Crete. I think before the cameras came on, you were telling me about a story of Crete, how this imagery is seen there as well.
Yeah. So essentially what the scholars say is that this worship of the bull, this religious practice, it was a ceremony. It eventually spread from Egypt up to Crete, Greece, and so forth. And so we have this, this painting, this fresco that's up in Crete, and you can see this person essentially doing acrobatics. One person's holding the bull's horns, another person's doing sort of flips over the cow. There's other pictures of this. This was part of a very specific practice. Again, they would jump over the cow, and this is actually what they say eventually led to bullfighting in Europe and Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, and eventually even came over to the United States and is sort of the history behind rodeos. Now, I'm not saying rodeos are pagan, but that's part of the practice of this public ceremony. Well, further, when you look at some of the petroglyphs there in Saudi Arabia, notice here, you've got a picture of the cow, you've got one person holding the horn, another person standing on the back holding the horn. Again, essentially identical to these paintings, these frescoes, portraying a religious ceremony. So it's amazing, again, just the more that you look at the details, even though they're just stick figures, the degree to which they conform to exactly what we would expect to find if indeed this is the real Mount Sinai.
Now, there's another clue to this being the real Mount Sinai. When you took the tour group over there, you saw in person, up close and personal. When we see something in 2D on a photograph, we can't really see the shape of the mountain. Now, you had mentioned to me, again, before the cameras came on, you were hinting that there was, there's a ridge, or there's two kind of peaks, and it explains some things in the Bible. Could you do some justice to that, or I'm not really doing it some justice?
Sure. Yeah, so the first time I went a few years ago, we wanted to hike to the top, but we didn't make it. So this time we went, we took the tour group, but we also stayed afterwards with some friends, and we hiked up to the top. And that was absolutely amazing. So we accomplished what we wanted to the first time. But when you're looking at the mountain, you can see, I'll say the belly button. That's the cave of what we assume is the cave of Elijah. If this is Mount Sinai, there has to be a prominent cave. Indeed, there is a prominent cave right on the face. Well, when you step back a little bit, you can see how high up the cave is. And then when you step back even further, you can see that there's essentially two tiers. There's two peaks to the mountain. Okay, now, when biblical scholars read the biblical narrative, they have come away, without seeing this at all, they've come away with the conclusion that the mountain has two tiers. It has sort of a peak, but then it has a higher peak. Because when you read the story of the elders of Israel and Moses and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, they go up, and after the covenant, they eat a feast on top of the mountain. But then the Lord calls Moses all the way up. He says to the elders, he says, "You shall worship me from a distance." But he calls Moses all the way up. Well, when you look at the mountain, you can see the sort of two tiers here, because you can't see the highest peak from the base. You have to get further back. Well, when we hiked up and we got over the ridge past Elijah's cave, here's what we saw. There is essentially a plateau up there. It's like a bowl. It's probably the size of a football field. It's a very level area, and it's surrounded by a ridge all the way around. And when we got up there, we said, my goodness, when the Bible says they ate and they drank and they saw God, they looked up at God's feet, and it was like a pavement of lapis lazuli, like the clear blue sky. We go, this is clearly where it happened. As you get up closer to the mountain, you can see. This picture right here, this is probably another 2-hour hike to the top. So it's hard to capture the scale of this. It's massive. And here's a beautiful picture that a friend of mine took as we camped that night. We didn't plan it at all. Scott, this was the last night of Sukkot. We camped on Mount Sinai the last night of Sukkot with the Milky Way over us. And as we sat there and we said, this is clearly where Moses and Aaron and the 70 elders ate the marriage supper, the sealing of the covenant on Mount Sinai. If you were trying to design a set design just based on the biblical narrative of the mountain, you could not create a better layout than what you find there at Jebel al-Lawz.
Well, we're going to get more into this in a second, because there's far more to the story. And if you are appreciating this, we encourage you to support Shabbat Night Live, because that's how we brought Joel here. So through your support, there's no corporate support, there's no large bank account that's funding this show. It's all up to you. You are our only sponsor. Now, imagine that you are Joshua. You're at the top of the mountain with Moses, and you're just amazed. You're visiting with God, and you hear something down in the camp. You can't see the camp, and we'll get into that in just a second, but you hear something. You're trying to figure out what's going on. It sounds like something, but then it doesn't sound like something. Joel Richardson, that's the story we hear or the story we read in Exodus 32. Joshua hears something, and they decide it's not what they think it is. What's going on there, and how can it tell us something about the real Mount Sinai?
Yeah, and this is fascinating because, as we mentioned in the last segment, as we got up there at the plateau, that's again, we'll say at the top of the mountain, yay, halfway up the mountain. As I was looking at this, I'm saying, again, just dumbfounded. Think this has to be the place. I mean, it's kind of like, duh. This is obviously the place where Moses and the elders ate the supper after the covenant was sealed, because it just makes sense. It aligns with the biblical narrative. Then I was reading in Exodus 32, 17 through 18. So this is the episode where, as you said, Moses had been up on the mountain. He'd been up there for a long time. And then you have the golden calf catastrophe. I mean, this is one of the worst events in redemptive history. I'm shy of the Noah's flood. I mean, it was a horrible, in the middle of the wedding, in the middle of the covenant, God is on the mountain in fire. And right in front of him, they decide to build a golden calf idol, and they're engaged in all of this idolatry. And in verse 17, it says this. Now Joshua is up there. He's halfway up the mountain with Moses. Moses is all the way up, and Joshua is probably at the plateau that's halfway up. It says, now when Joshua heard the sound of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, there is a sound of war in the camp. So notice they can hear, they don't see it, okay, but they can hear it. But he said, it is not the sound of the cry of triumph, nor is it the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing I hear. So Moses and Joshua, they're probably, again, they're at the plateau. They can hear the idolaters, but they can't see them.
Why not?
And this is what's so fascinating. So again, going back, looking at the picture of Jebel al-Lawz, you have this bowl, you have this plateau up there, and it's surrounded by a ridge. The ridge is probably 40, 50 feet high. It's like a wall. And you cannot see, on a typical mountain, you could just look down. If the idolaters are at the base of the mountain or somewhere close, you could just look down and see them. But with Jebel al-Lawz, you couldn't, but you could hear them. There's a very peculiar dynamic, sort of a...
It's like an amphitheater type of thing?
Exactly. It's like an amphitheater where it's amazing when you're on the mountain, you can hear people just talking. Hundreds of feet below, you can hear them talking, and they're just like ants. It echoes up there. But once you get out of this plateau, once you go over the ridge, as you get closer to the cave of Elijah, you can see directly down to the golden calf altar. I mean, it's right there in front of you, which, by the way, when Elijah was in the cave and he's wrestling with all of this stuff concerning Baal worship and Jezebel and Ahab, and he's thinking, I'm the only one, and all of Israel has fallen into idolatry, etc. He's in the cave and he's looking down, meditating in terms of what happened with the golden calf incident. And I'm sure the Lord was saying to him, look, Pee-wee, don't get me wrong, Elijah, but you're not the only one. This has happened before. I've always had a remnant, right? Behold, I have kept 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee to Baal. So it's actually a very similar situation in Elijah's life. But so once again, the layout, the topography of Jebel al-Lawz is exactly what we would expect to find according to the biblical narrative.
Wow, that is amazing. So I wanted to key in on something you said right before the break, is that when they are on this plateau, the 24 elders and Moses, and they're eating, they're having a dinner. And that seems to me, like you said, it's a marriage supper of the Lamb. You have a wedding, and then you always have a feast. There's always a feast after a wedding. It's a biblical thing. It happens in Israeli, Hebrew culture all the time. So when they are having this dinner, they're sealing the covenant. As we know from Hebrew prophecy, it's not like we understand from a Greek mindset where something happens, it's fulfilled, it's done, leave it in the past, what's next? Hebrew thought kind of goes in cycles. It happens, it'll happen again one way, it'll happen again another way, and it's not one and done. So is that what we're seeing here, is that this ratifying of a covenant with a marriage? Is that what we're seeing as a foreshadowing for the marriage supper of the Lamb with Yeshua?
Yeah, exactly. And I actually want to dig into this a lot deeper. So essentially, and this is what most Christians don't understand. Most Christians, they look at the various biblical covenants. They're very favorable toward the Abrahamic covenant. You know, they say, I will bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you. They love to cite the Abrahamic covenant because God gave the land to Israel, but they look very negatively, by and large, on Sinai because it's Torah. It's the law, you know, and they'll primarily only quote some of the statements that Paul makes that do speak of Torah that seem to be negative, you know, but that they don't read the full context of everything that Paul said. But the reality is the biblical prophets, the entire, anyone who was Old Testament literate, the entire Hebrew community, the Israelites, they understood that the covenant at Mount Sinai was patterned deliberately by God to be a betrothal, a marriage or a betrothal ceremony. And so the covenant, every covenant is sealed with blood. Well, not every covenant, but certainly the Abrahamic, certainly the new covenant. Mount Sinai was sealed with blood. The bulls, and Moses applies the blood to the people. But it was also sealed with a feast. It was sealed with a feast. So what's interesting here, and again, we could probably get into this a bit more, most Christians are taught, who believe in the pre-tribulational rapture, they're taught that while Israel suffers on the earth, that the church is up in heaven eating the marriage supper of the Lamb. That is to fundamentally misunderstand, to misinterpret the biblical foundation. The biblical foundation for the marriage supper of the Lamb is the feast that took place at the sealing, the ratifying of the covenant on top of Mount Sinai. And now it starts out on Sinai. Later, Isaiah 25, says, in that day, in the day of the Messiah, after the Messiah has come back, I will throw a lavish feast, a lavish banquet. Where? On Mount Zion. He says it will be a lavish banquet of aged wine. Sorry, Baptists. And choice marrow. Sorry, vegans. Right? You've got marrow and wine and, you know, it's a feast. Well, so essentially Isaiah was saying what began at Sinai will be completed at Mount Zion. So when Jesus comes along, when Yeshua comes along, and he says, and by the way, it will be a feast, Isaiah says, for all peoples, for all of the the Gentile. It's not just for the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all peoples. So when Jesus comes along and he's talking about the faithfulness of the Gentiles, he says, I tell you the truth, many will come from the east and the west, and they will recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What feast is he talking about? He's talking about the feast of Isaiah 25, okay? This becomes the biblical basis for the concept of the marriage supper of the Lamb. Isaiah also makes reference in Isaiah 2, where does it happen? On Mount Zion, right? Clearly on Mount Zion. So the idea that this all takes place in heaven while Israel suffers, far be it. This is Israel's wedding. This is Israel's wedding renewal ceremony. It is the sealing of the deal. And we who are Gentiles, we are grafted into the commonwealth of Israel. We are inheritors of this thing. We are part of this thing because, as he said, many Gentiles, all peoples will come from the east and the west, and we become part of it. But where does it take place? It happens in Jerusalem, on the ground, on Mount Zion. That's where the grapes are. That's where the marrow is, you know, and it's not until the king, the son of David, is enthroned on the throne of his father David on Mount Zion that the wedding feast will take place.
I love how you explain that. And you know, even just myself, who's not a biblical scholar, can now understand that. And I have a whole new appreciation for the story of how Sinai leads to Zion and that whole connection. And I'm thinking that, you know, far be it from me, those who would really understand these things would be scholars. And I think once scholars understand this, they're going to be very interested in Sinai specifically. And you have something planned for that. Tell us about what's going on there.
Yeah, so I'll mention my tour company. It's Living Passages. And Rhonda Sand is my tour gal. She has worked it hard. She's a real pro. And so she's the one that really got us into Saudi Arabia in the first place. So we went in October 2019. We were supposed to go October 2020, but something happened in 2020. We won't talk about that. But obviously it was delayed because of COVID. So I'll actually be going back in February, which is probably around the time that this program will be aired. I'll be going back, and I'll be going back multiple times in the future. But beyond that, beyond the tours to the mountain, we also have planned a scholar symposium. So what was interesting is when we were there, we were bumping into, and people were sending us messages from scholars. Now, these were Saudi Muslim scholars that had done their PhD work on the Midianite presence in that whole area. So again, the Muslims are very interested in all of this. So we're going to actually have a gathering of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scholars, biblical scholars, archaeologists, Old Testament scholars gathered together there in Northwest Saudi Arabia. The date is not nailed down yet, but it'll be sometime in early 2021. And just to get together, because listen, here's the fact. It's one thing for Joel Richardson to go over there. It's another, Ron Wyatt and some of these different voices that have been pointing to this over the years. Once the mainstream scholars really begin digging into this, there's going to be so many discoveries. Behind the scenes, by the way, I'll just say, I have seen all kinds of artifacts that they're not allowed to be seen by the public yet. Jewish artifacts, all kinds of artifacts are going to be brought forth. They're building a new museum there in Tabuk. But when the scholars get a hold of this, this is going to become the single greatest biblical and religious archaeology site at the whole region in history. I mean, even beyond many of the great finds in Israel and so forth, this is going to become huge. So over the next decade, I'm predicting that once the scholars really start doing digs, getting the permission to do these things, this is going to become huge. And if you think about it, you had, before COVID 2019, you had, I think, about 4 million tourists to Israel in a year, 60% of which were Christian. When this thing really fully opens to the public, the potential for tourism of all faiths, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, to this whole area, I believe it's going to actually, within a decade, begin rivaling some of the biblical sites in Israel. And so it's going to become huge. And it's very important, obviously, that the Saudis understand this, that they protect it, that they preserve it, that they prepare it for all of these guests. And hopefully it won't be, like a bunch of people selling trinkets at the base of the mountain, that they'll kind of maintain the isolation, the ambiance of what it is when you go there now. And I trust that they will do that. They've done a good job with some of their other archaeological sites, Al-Ula in Saudi Arabia. So I trust that they're going to do that.
Now, when you go on your tours, just as an aside here, you take people obviously to Mount Sinai. Yeah. Where else do you go around there? I mean, some people may not even know some of the places you've mentioned I haven't even heard of before. So where do you go?
So we also go to a town called Al-Bad, which interestingly, another name for it in Arabic is Muga al-Shu'aib, which means the caves of Jethro.
Ah, okay. This we've heard of. Kevin Fisher presented something for us at Shabbat Night Live about these places. He went there too.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, this is very close to Mount Sinai. So we go to Jethro's house for all intents and purposes. We go to a place called Wadi Tayyib al-Ism. Now, this is just a natural crevice through the rock. There's a lot of speculation as to whether or not it could play a part in the biblical narrative, in the Exodus narrative. Regardless, it is a stunning, beautiful, unparalleled place to go and camp and this type of thing. We also do go down to Al-Ula, to Tima, which is biblical Dedan, okay? So the caravans of the Dedanites. And you actually have ancient, very ancient, I guess what is the term, Proto-Sinaitic Hebrew script down there, okay? So these are sort of the forgotten biblical sites, many of them, and that is also where there is Al-Ula, which is often referred to as the southern Petra. Stunningly beautiful, stunningly beautiful. And again, everywhere we go, the Saudis are so welcoming, so friendly and hospitable, and we have a wonderful time.
I hope you're right that they protect this area. It has been protected already. I mean, there's fences around a lot of these sites already, that archaeological sites. They recognize there's something special here. They haven't just destroyed it because we recognize this is the Hebrew story. We better get rid of this. Right. But there has been some vandalism. We know that Dr. Kim One of the most famous pictures we know of in this area of study is him pointing to one of the earliest petroglyphs of a menorah. And something has happened to that now.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people, on the internet, they've seen the pictures of Dr. Kim having found this ancient carving of a menorah, and he did his best to sort of hide its location, but it has been destroyed. There's some folks that went back there last year, and it's just chiseled away completely. There's just like a square cut out of the rock, and it was just destroyed. So hopefully things like this won't happen. And for the most part, the locals are very respectful. They understand. When I was there, my particular driver was a hunter. He was a Bedouin from that area. And he said he knew hundreds of other petroglyphs up in the mountains. He would point up there and he would say, up there is a cross, up there in the mountains. He said, the Christian monks used to be up there, and he would point to all these. So again, given enough time, I think we're going to discover hundreds, if not thousands, of ancient signs of the Jewish, Christian, and eventual Muslim presence in that whole area.
And with the Muslim people who live there, like you said, the Bedouins and such, and the locals, they will know stories that no one else does, and no one has bothered to ask them these stories. And so we'll probably discover that there's been a whole history, like the monks, a whole history of people over the ages who have been there and have always recognized it. Perhaps we'll find out, like Nehemiah Gordon has found out, that the name of Yehovah that's on our mugs here never went anywhere. It just took modern, the internet, for these things to be put up on the internet, and for people who knew what it was to look at it and say, look, the name of God has never gone anywhere. We found 1,500, 2,000 examples of it. Do you think we're going to find something like this at Mount Sinai?
It itself is the stunning thing. I mean, it's just sitting there. You go to Israel, and again, I love Israel, and people say this is where Paul did a miracle, or this is where Jesus walked. But for the most part, most of it is 20 feet underground type of thing. This with Mount Sinai, it's not like that. It's just sitting there. It's just sitting there for any bozo and yahoo. Some of it's protected and fenced off, but for the most part, it's just sitting there out in the desert. It's not 10 feet underground, and that's what's so amazing. I jokingly say, thank God for Islamic law. Because if not, all these American yahoos would have been going over there for years, and we probably would have been the ones damaging things, but they have protected it. Saudi Arabia has been closed, and I believe that is according to the sovereign plan of God. It's now in His timing. Now in His timing, that at this moment in history of the world, this moment of unbelief, most of the scholars of the Exodus, they don't even believe the Exodus is real. Many Jews today, they don't believe it's real. It's at this moment that the Lord is about to open this thing up to the world, because what does He say throughout the Passover? Do not forget. Remember, 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 do not forget. And the Lord Himself is about to use this entire thing to say to an unbelieving world, remember, remember this. Because the Lord Himself has a testimony in a very powerful way.
Absolutely, and I love how He uses everything. You look at this and I sit back and laugh that Yehovah is in control. I mean, everybody thinks, oh no, look, the Islamic world is taking over, and all these biblical sites like Mount Sinai and Noah's Ark in Turkey. Well, these people have protected these things, and they're a history of the biblical narrative. And like you said, our Western curiosity may have very well gone in and destroyed these things inadvertently. And so thank God for Jehovah's children in every respect that they are. So we're going to dig in more into this next time. Can you come back next week and we'll talk more?
Absolutely.
All right, thanks, Joel. All right, well, thank you for joining us on Shabbat Night Live this week. We are talking about Mount Sinai, the proof of Mount Sinai, and things you have never heard about it. We are about to get into things you have never heard before. So come back next week on Shabbat Night Live. Until then, Shavua Tov, Shabbat Shalom.